Thank you very much. And let's just let it.
Good.
That way you have plenty of time to go.
Because I got lots of cover.
Yeah, well, that'll give you 45 minutes or so. And thank you, sir. Hey, how are you? You ready?
Charlotte Avenue. When I was a student, Brother Dixon, Helen Charlotte Avenue.
Hey there.
Yeah.
That guy right yonder.
Yeah.
Check it in.
College Street there. Yeah. And you know, there's an apartment building in there. Breaks my heart. I love that old building. We sat in the balcony. That's supposed to. Did you ever know Eva Jean Rather? Her father was an elder there.
And how you doing?
She was a scholar. Restoration. She wrote books out there. He wasn't coming back all of it. She grew up in Charlotte.
This meeting in the fine auditorium. I've got about yeah, the mayor. Yeah. My little classroom, I bet also Wayne and I went to hear Paul Martin. Always loved to hear good speakers.
Hope that you are enjoying your meal and will continue to do so. But it is also time for us to begin welcoming our brother Alan Hires and looking forward to his lecture for us here during this lunch hour. In just a moment, Matt Vega, the Dean of the Business School here, is going to introduce Brother Hires. But before that, just a general announcement. We've had a good development, but a little bit of a challenging development this morning with the teen lectures. 2 years ago, we had maybe 55 or 60 for the most for our students in the teen lectures, and the rooms in GC were large enough. So I prepared this morning and did not make enough copies because we had nearly 120 young persons, almost double, or basically double, 2 years ago. And the room is made to accommodate 68 people. So they are going to be utilizing this afternoon and each day for the rest of the week, Ayers Auditorium. And they are set to start at 12:30, which is going to be right in the heart of Brother Hires' discussion. So what we're going to do is, number one, say we're grateful for this problem because it's great to have double the young people that we had before. And number two, just thank you so much for your patience and Brother Hires for his patience. They're going to be sneaking in this side door, and I'm going to be over there reminding them to be quiet as they just file right into the side into Ayers Auditorium. And once they're in, I think that it'll be quiet and they'll get their business done. And we just appreciate you and your patience with this change of venues for them. At this point, I'll turn it over to Brother Bacon. Thank you.
I know you all know our speaker well, and I think that's, I'm sure that and the food was a big draw for this session. But I really want to just express my personal gratitude to him. He is one of the giants that I grew up listening to, primarily at the Spiritual Sword lectureships. And I remember collecting, I was kind of a nerd when I was a kid, right? And so I collected all the back issues of the Spiritual Sword and kept them in a little plastic accordion file. And I really cut my teeth spiritually on his editorials and his selection of writers, many of whom are probably in this room. And I just want to remind us of what legacy is all about. And it's not about stuff. It's not about how much you can accumulate. It's about how much you can give. And give to people that'll make an eternal difference. And that kind of legacy is something that Judge Hires has effectively I think, provided an example to folks like me that when my dad would introduce me at the various lectureships as a young child, he'd introduce me as someone who's going to be a future preacher. And when I turned out to be a lawyer, it was a little bit of disappointment. But I was able to turn to people like Brother Hires and some folks here on the screen. And I was able to use them as examples on how I could serve the kingdom in my own profession. So let me say, Alan Hires, it says here his bio, has probably spoken more often on the Freed-Hardeman lectureship than any other person now living. He conducted the Open Forum for 15 years. He graduated from Freed-Hardeman, Lipscomb University, and the University of Memphis School of Law. He served over 30 years in the Tennessee judicial system. He and his wife, Sandra, live here in Henderson, Tennessee, and they have 2 daughters, 4 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Brother Hires.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. I express special gratitude to Doug Burleson and his wife, Christy, for all the help they've been to me, to Matt for his nice words of introduction, and Tom Childers, who has helped me arrange the visual aids that I will try to use this afternoon. My topic is great debaters in churches of Christ. And I might say this about debates. There was a time that debating was a very effective means of promulgating the truth. People would come to a debate from miles around. I can remember the first debate I ever attended. I was in high school. I would see people get off the bus at a bus stop and run to the building where the debate was being conducted to make sure they got a good seat. And we'll have something to show about the crowds as we proceed in our study today. But you may wonder why there are not any, or maybe we could say many, debates today, when at one time they were so very, very popular. And I want to mention 2 or 3 things about that, and I'm sure there are others that could be named. But one thing is, people are not as involved today in Bible study as they once were. There was a time that people carried a Bible with them, sometimes to work. They might read it during their lunch hour. They talked to other people they worked with about the church and about the Bible. And there was a general interest in what the Bible had to say, in learning and in Bible study. So I think that has declined, and it's one reason that we do not have the number of debates that we once had. Another reason for the decline in debates is there has been a change in our preaching. Once upon a time, in a gospel meeting, preachers dealt with denominational error. They talked about matters of doctrine. They stirred up the community. Very often they baptized people out of denominationalism. And denominational preachers felt they had to come to a defense. And they would challenge for debates. And many younger preachers especially would go into an area to conduct a meeting and maybe baptize a number of people out of denominationalism and find themselves challenged by some denominational preacher in the area or in the community. And so today we do not have as much of an emphasis on denominational error in our preaching. And that's one reason for the decline of debating. A number of years ago, M.C. Curfees, who certainly was one of the great preachers of yesteryear, wrote a series of 3 articles in the Gospel Advocate. The name of those 3 articles, published in 1928, The Continued Need of Emphasis on the Restoration of the Ancient Order. That series of 3 articles by M.C. Curfees was immensely popular. And there were dozens of requests that came in to the editors of the Gospel Advocate to publish it in booklet form. And the Advocate did so. They published Curfees' 3 articles in a booklet, and they reprinted it several times. They kept it in print for years and years. Might be hard to find today. I don't know if it's still available or not. But at one time, they published reprints and kept it available. And I highly recommend it to you. If you have never read, I don't know whether you could find the booklet or not, but you could go back to the 1928 Gospel Advocate and find 3 different articles by Curfees. It is some of the richest material I've ever read. And I would highly recommend it to your study. But one of the things that Curfees says in his articles that I thought was quite interesting and relates to debating, he talks about 7 famous debates, including 3 of the ones by Alexander Campbell. And he says the demand for these 7 famous debates from 1829 to 1870 were brought about largely by the aggressive, uncompromising, and unyielding fight waged by the faithful and fearless preachers of the time against denominationalism and all other forms of division among the people of God. And then Curfees said, similar results would doubtless follow today if all the preachers professing to be undenominational were still making the same aggressive, uncompromising, and unyielding fight. And Curfees adds, the trouble today is there is too great a let-up among the preachers in waging war against error in any and all forms. I thought that was an interesting commentary that was made by Kerfees in this series of articles. And then the third and last reason that I would mention for the decline in the number of debates is that there are no longer any denominational champions. There was a time that the denominations had a few preachers who were champion debaters for their cause. Chief among them, and I'll say more about him momentarily, the Baptist debater Ben M. Bogard. Bogard was the most famous Baptist debater of all time and debated many of our brethren. Had over 200 debates during his lifetime. And he debated others besides members of the church, but primarily he debated members of the church. There were several disciples of Bogard who were debaters. I debated two of them, Albert Garner and Hoyt Chastain. But there are no more champions. The Pentecostals had a famous debater, D.L. Welch. I debated D.L. Welch in St. Petersburg, Florida. G.K. Wallace served as my moderator during that debate. But you don't have any of these denominational champions anymore. So the lack of Bible study, the lack of aggressive preaching, and the lack of denominational champions all have led to this decline in the number of debates that we have. But for a number of years, debates were very popular. As I mentioned, Ben Bogard had more than 200 debates. One of our brethren who debated, Joe S. Warlick, had nearly 400 debates, probably more than any other debater we could name. The last figure that I read said that Warlick had 399 debates, 23 of them with Bogard. They debated that many times. And I've got a great story I want to tell you about one of their experiences, one of their debates, as we get to it in our study. But I want to begin by talking about one of the great debaters of all time, Alexander Campbell. Died in 1866. Alexander Campbell had 9 debates, 5 of them published, 3 of them outstanding, and Campbell made this statement after his second debate: a week's debating is worth a year's preaching. For the purpose of disseminating truth and putting error out of countenance. A week's debating is worth a year's preaching, said Campbell. And I want to mention a little bit about Campbell's debates. First debate Campbell ever had was in 1820. He debated a Presbyterian preacher named John Walker. John Walker's first speech in the debate lasted about 3 minutes. In the book that was published, it occupied 12 lines. Someone might think he was a little overconfident. Campbell had been preaching in the area and baptizing a number of Presbyterians who had only been sprinkled. And Walker challenged Campbell for a debate, but obviously he was no match for Campbell as a speaker, as a debater, or as a thinker. And as a result of that debate, Campbell became very widely known. And the Baptists especially admired Campbell because they had been in controversy with the Presbyterians about baptism, and they regarded Campbell as a champion because he was able to vanquish a Presbyterian debater like John Walker. So about 3 years later, in 1823, Campbell had another debate again with a Presbyterian, W.L. McCullough. The Campbell-Walker debate, the Campbell-McCullough debate were both published in book form, still can be found today. And then the third debate that Campbell had, one of his most famous, perhaps the most famous, 1829, he met Robert Owen. Owen was a skeptic, infidel, one of the most famous men of his time, and Campbell met Owen in debate on the evidences of Christianity. I'll tell you an interesting thing about that debate. You may be familiar with the format most debates pursue, but I'll mention it for the benefit of those who may not have been exposed to it. Debates usually ran about 2 hours per night. The affirmative would have 30 minutes, the negative 30 minutes, then the affirmative another 30-minute speech, and the negative a final 30-minute speech. So it'd be 4 30-minute speeches per night in most debates in those times. Well, Campbell got in the debate with Owen, and Owen said, well, instead of us going back and forth, he told Campbell, why don't you just speak as long as you want and present whatever evidence you desire, and I'll respond to it afterwards. Campbell spoke 12 hours. That's a fact. Now, I don't want you to think he talked 12 hours without interruption. They would take breaks. It actually went on for several days. I think he started about 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and he spoke that day and Saturday, and he finished his discourse sometime on Sunday. But he spoke 12 hours. That gives you an idea of the intellect of a man like Alexander Campbell, that he was able to speak 12 hours in defense of Christianity. But the 12-hour speech of Campbell in the Owen debate is a classic. And this spread the knowledge of Campbell far and wide. In 1837, he debated a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church in Cincinnati, John B. Purcell. And then final debate, and one of the strongest discussions was his debate with the Presbyterian N.L. Rice, and that was in 1843. So Campbell was a very powerful debater. And the debates, especially the 5 that I mentioned, 3 of them in particular, very strong defenses of what Campbell was endeavoring to teach at that time. Now I want to move on from Alexander Campbell to some of debaters that you may be more familiar with. Well, now I forgot I wanted to tell you about L.H. Brown. L.H. Brown was a Baptist debater here in this area. He had a radio program over here at Jackson, and he loved to attack Freed-Hardeman, and especially all of us young preacher boys at Freed-Hardeman. He'd get on the radio every Sunday. He'd even make statements like, "You boys down there at Henderson." And so I was preaching for a country church up in Carroll County, Tennessee, named Poplar Springs. And there are 2 men here that were boys when I was preaching there, and they were at this debate, first debate I ever had. 1957, I challenged Kelby Tolley to a debate. That's the guy there on the left. That's Brown's son-in-law. Well, the brethren there at Poplar Springs endorsed me to debate Kelby Tolley. And the letter I got back was not from Kelby Tolley. It was from his father-in-law, L.H. Brown. I was 19. Brown was 62. L.H. Brown had debated G.E. Woods, Guy Woods' brother, B.B. James, James R. Cope, W. Curtis Porter. He was an experienced debater, and I was just a boy. And the brethren said, "Go ahead and accept." So I accepted the challenge to debate L.H. Brown. This is actually a picture of the debate at Poplar Springs that I had with L.H. Brown. Kelby Tolley on the left, moderated for him, L.H. Brown, and you can see in the background there the tent and the crowd. People came from everywhere, and we had a wonderful discussion. Brown referred to me as the Camelot Kid. And I said to him, Mr. Brown, if a kid could do this to you, what would happen if one of our men got a hold of you? But the main reason that I mentioned this debate, one question that everyone always asks about debating, do they do any good? And I just wanted to begin by pointing out that when this debate was over, Brother Benny Collins, who was an elder at Poplar Springs, and I sat down and counted the number of baptisms we knew about that resulted from this debate. And we counted 15 people who were converted as a result of the debate. I'm going to mention another debate in a little bit with even more strong results. But I just mentioned that in passing to indicate how the debates were able to accomplish a lot of good. Foy Wallace Jr., many of you knew Brother Wallace. All of you knew of Brother Wallace. Passed away in 1979. There's Brother Wallace in his younger years. And let's have the next one. There's another picture of him in his younger years. Brother Wallace debated a Baptist preacher out in Fort Worth named J. Frank Norris. Now that name may not mean as much to you today as it would have a few years ago, but I will say this. If there was a Billy Graham in that day, it was J. Frank Norris. He had a huge congregation there in Fort Worth. And Norris was not the most ethical fellow that you ever met. He shot and killed a man in his office. He was tried for murder, but acquitted. He was famous all over the South. And he debated Foy Wallace in 1934. I want to show you a picture of the crowd. Can we get that up there? Well, here's Brother Wallace in later years. Look at that lower picture. It's not very clear. It's from an old newspaper. But there is a view of the crowd at the Norris and Wallace debate. How I wish we had recordings. How I wish we even had a book. But Norris was such a unreliable character that Brother Wallace could not get a clear copy of the debate. Norris wanted to doctor it up. And eventually Brother Wallace had to go to law to keep Norris from publishing a distorted copy of the discussion. But it was an enormous occurrence with a tremendous attendance back in 1934. All right? I want to talk to you a moment about Ben M. Bogard. Died in 1951. The reason that I mentioned Bogard, we're talking about great debaters among churches of Christ. But it's hard to talk about the debates of our brethren without referring to this one man, the greatest Baptist debater of all time. Lived in Little Rock, Arkansas. Here he is in his middle years. Here he is in his advanced years. Bogard had 237 debates. he was the champion among the Baptists. Now, I want to give you a quote from Ben Bogard. And this quote was verified to me by two different preachers. One was W.L. Toddy, who asked Bogard. The other was Gus Nichols. Our brethren were always curious. Since Bogard debated so many of our brethren, who do you consider the greatest debater you ever met? And both men that told me the story, and that was on separate occasions when they revealed this to me, both of them said, Bogard answered this way: the greatest logician you have is C.R. Nicholl. The greatest at taking an audience away from you is G.C. Brewer. The greatest at repartee is Joe S. Warnick. Repartee meaning a quick and usually witty reply. And Bogard said the greatest all-around debater was N.B. Hardeman. So I wanted to mention what Bogard said about debaters among our brethren, so that when I come to them, you'll understand that Bogard valued them in the various respects that I have identified. So let's begin with C.R. Nicholl. I heard Brother Nicholl on two occasions. One was he came here to Freed-Hardeman and spoke in chapel one day. First time I'd ever seen him. He was in a meeting with the Foot Street Church in Corinth, Mississippi. So a group of us boys drove down to Foot Street and heard him one night in the meeting. And when the service was over, I credit Brother Nicholl for this, he went out in front of the building and stood as long as we wanted to talk to him. And we conversed with Brother Nicholl out there on the steps of the Foot Street building. But C.R. Nicholl, by the way, you see that white hair? They said that his hair turned white when he was about 25 years of age. So that was a mark of his throughout all of his days. And Brother Nicholl was from up here around Murfreesboro, Tennessee, but spent most of his years in the town of Clifton, Texas, and had many, many debates. I have a debate in my library called the Nicholl-Bradley debate that was conducted in 1906. So he was quite an accomplished debater. And he's the one that Bogard said was the greatest logician, greatest at using logic of anyone that we had. But I wanted to tell you about a debate C.R. Nicholl had. This was down at Amory, Mississippi, a place many of us are familiar with. And the debate that Brother Nicholl had at Amory was with the Seventh-day Adventists. Ordinarily, we think about debates with the Baptists. Primarily, we debated with the Baptists. Very often about baptism or once saved, always saved. But this was a debate that C.R. Nicholl had with the Adventists. At the conclusion of his debate with the Adventists, Brother Nicholl conducted a gospel meeting. 99 people obeyed the gospel. They heard the debate, they were convicted, they were convinced, and they were converted. That was the beginning of the Christian Chapel Church at Amory. And I've been there, I've preached there. How many of you know Christian Chapel? A lot of you. That's one of the finest rural congregations that I know of. But not many people know that it started as a result of a debate that Brother Nicholl had with the Adventists. Moving on, I want to talk a little about G.C. Brewer. I knew Brother Brewer and admired him so very much. He was one of the most powerful men in the pulpit that I ever heard in my life. Here's a picture of him when he was 28 years old. Go to the next one. This is probably the same picture, just an enlarged view of it. And then here is Brother Brewer in his last years. This is said to be the final picture that was ever taken of Brother Brewer before he died. That is on the steps of the Jackson Avenue Church in Memphis, where Brother Brewer was preaching. Brother Brewer had cancer and passed away in 1956. And while he was in the hospital at Rogers Hospital in Searcy, Arkansas, a friend of mine here in school, Leonard Smith, and I drove to Searcy and went to see Brother Brewer. And we visited with him in his hospital room before he passed away. Leonard, incidentally, was the great-grandson of T.B. Larimore. And I thought it was quite interesting when we entered the hospital room, Sister Brewer said to Brother Brewer, "Do you know who this is?" He said, "Yes, that's Brother Larimore's great-grandson." So he recognized who Leonard was. And Leonard and I sat with him and sat by his bedside and talked to him. But Brother Brewer was a powerful speaker. And he's the one that Bogard said could take an audience away from you. And Brother Brewer debated with Bogard. He debated numerous others during his lifetime. I have somewhere the tapes of a debate that G.C. Brewer had with D.N. Jackson. D.N. Jackson was a friend of Bogard and was also a very well-known debater in his time. And that debate was in Fulton, Mississippi, and Brother Jeffcoat was the preacher there. He recorded it, and W.D. Jeffcoat, his son, gave me a copy of it some years ago. If you want to read about Brother Brewer's first debate, get his book called 40 Years on the Firing Line. And in there, he tells about the first debate he ever had. It was in Walker County, Alabama. Brother Brewer was in his early 20s, I think 22, held a meeting down in Walker County, was challenged for debate, and had a debate there in Walker County, Alabama. And he tells about it in that book, 40 Years on the Firing Line. But I'm going to tell you something that's not in the book. It's a fascinating book and a fascinating story about Brewer's first debate. But I heard Brother Brewer tell a story that he didn't put in the book. Brother Brewer said that he went to a general store while he was holding the meeting down there. And there was a group of men congregated out on the porch of this general store. And the Baptist preacher was one of the men. And when Brother Brewer came up, of course, they knew who he was. They knew he was holding a meeting for the church. And the Baptist preacher said to him, "Preacher, let me ask you a question." He said, Acts 18 and verse 8, "Many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. And Crispus also believed." He said, it doesn't say Crispus was baptized. He said, "I'll tell you what, I'll give him a horse and buggy over there if you'll show me where Crispus was ever baptized." Now I heard Brewer tell this. He told the man, "Well, go to the first chapter of 1 Corinthians and read for us verse 14. And the man turned over there and he started to read. He said, the man said, "I thank God that I baptized none of you save Crispus." And gave Brother didn't know. I didn't take his horse and buggy, but he said it made a real impression on all those men that were sitting out there on the porch. And that led to the debate that Brother Brewer had down there. By the way, he taught me something with that idea. It shows the comprehensive use of the word belief or faith. Crispus also believed, and the man was right. In that verse, it doesn't say anything about him being baptized, but we learn of it elsewhere. But that shows that the word believe there was used in that comprehensive sense that involved and included his baptism. Well, C.R. Nichol, the greatest logician, G.C. Brewer, the greatest to take an audience away from you, Freed-Hardeman, the best all-around debater. Brother Hardeman lived just about a block up the street here. Here's the way he looked in his younger years. There's a picture of him as he grew older. He was president here at Freed-Hardeman, of course, known for his eloquence, his oratory, and Hardeman never aspired to be known as a debater, but he debated when the occasion demanded. And one of his great debates was with Ira Boswell on instrumental music, held in 1923 in the Ryman Auditorium up in Nashville. And interesting story about that debate. Boswell and some of his advisors stayed up all night after the first night of the debate trying to figure out how to answer Hardeman. And in the book MBH, which is the biography of Brother Hardeman by his daughter and J.M. Powell, they say that Hardeman ran into Boswell at a train station, I believe, some years after the debate, and asked him if that story was true. And Boswell said, yes, it was. Sometimes when you read the Hardeman-Boswell debate, you don't really appreciate what Hardeman did, because what you have to realize when you read that debate, it did not involve the usual arguments that are made. 1923 was a time when the entire argument on instrumental music was based on the Greek word solo. And so that's what that discussion centered on, and you might not really appreciate the work that Brother Hardeman did if you don't understand that it was all about solo. And what Brother Hardeman pointed out, and the argument they couldn't answer, never did answer, was that the instrument does not inhere in the word. Now, it is true that the word solo meant to pluck or to twang, like the bricklayer might on the line to mark the brick, or to pluck the strings of the harp. And so that's why the people that were defending instrumental music used that word. But the thing about it is, the word meant to pluck or to twang, but it did not identify the instrument. You had to name the instrument in addition to the word. And Brother Hardeman said Ephesians 5:19 identifies the instrument as the heart. And they didn't know how to answer that. They didn't answer it. And it was a simple position, but it was the downfall of our Boswell. And then, of course, Hardeman also debated Bogard in Little Rock in 1938. That one was published in book form, and I suppose it's still available. One of the most famous debates of all time. But I want to tell you a story that's not in any book anywhere about Freed-Hardeman as a debater. When I was a student here in school, I preached at Estes. Not that nice new building you see out south of town on the highway, but old Estes is where I preached. It was a white frame building about maybe a quarter of a mile from where that one is located. And we had an old brother there named Mark Womble. Everybody called him Uncle Mark. He was probably 85 years old when I was a student. He attended N.B. Hardeman's first debate. N.B. Hardeman's first debate was with I.N. Pennick, who was a professor at Union University over here in Jackson. And Pennick was so highly respected that if you drive around on that campus today, you will see the Pennick building at Union University. Well, Pennick was a good deal older than Hardeman and quite well known, quite well educated, and he sort of made fun of Brother Hardeman for his youth. And Uncle Mark told me the story. Pennick said to Hardeman, "Does your mammy know you're here? Did your mammy give you permission to come today?" Ridiculing Hardeman for his youth. Brother Hardeman came back. He said, "Mr. Pennick wanted to know if my mammy knew I was here today. And did she give me permission to come?" He said, "Yes, sir. She gave me a nickel to buy a Baptist preacher with." Said, "You'll do." Though I would say that a lot of these debaters had a sense of humor, and there were a lot of interesting and even humorous events that occurred. Let's go to Joe S. Warlick. Unfortunately, I wish I could have known Joe S. Warlick. He died in 1941, a little before my time. Here's a picture of him as a younger man. I mentioned this about Warlick. You know, he's the one that Bogard said was the best at repartee. That is a quick, witty answer. And Guy Woods, who was quite an able debater himself, made this statement to me one time. He said, "I consider Joe S. Warlick to be the greatest debater since Alexander Campbell." That was the estimate Brother Woods had of Warlick as a debater. Well, I'm going to tell you a story or two about Warlick that I think you'll enjoy. Here is Warlick and Bogard during one of their debates. And we've zeroed in on the faces. Go back to that one, Tom, for just a moment. We zeroed in on the faces so you could get a view of the two men. Here's Warlick, here's Bogard. Now let's go to the other one. I want you to see their Prince Albert coats. You know, debates were quite serious events at the time, and they really dressed up for it. And it looks like maybe an auditorium there behind them where the debate was conducted. But I want to tell you a story or two about Joe S. Warlick. He and Bogard had 23 debates. And during one of their debates, they had to sleep together one night. What happened, they both got to town at the train depot, and Bogard's people were not there to pick him up. He had nowhere to go. Our brethren were there to pick up Brother Warlick. They had a room for him at the hotel, I guess. Brother Warlick said to Bogard, he said, "Well, I've got a room. You can spend the night with me till your brethren come and get you and take care of your accommodations." So they went to the hotel, spent the night together, slept together. So in one of their later debates, Bogard wanted to make capital of that. And he told the crowd, he said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Warlick and I are here to debate because we disagree on these issues." But he said, "I want you to know we're not enemies. We're friends." Why, he said one time we even slept together. But Bogard said, "I had to take a bath afterwards." Oh, the Baptists love that. Bogard said that about, "I had to take a bath afterwards." They slapped their knees and They thought that was hilarious. That was before Warwick got up. Warwick got up and said, well, friends, Mr. Bogart told you the truth. He said, we're not enemies, we're friends. We disagree on these issues, that's why we're here. And he said, it is true that one time we had to sleep together, but he said, how I wish you'd taken that bath before. You didn't make much on Warwick. Methodists have not been well known for debating. There was a famous Methodist debater named Jacob Ditzler. He debated J.R. Graves, one of the most famous Baptists of his time. The Graves-Ditzler debate was printed. He debated one of our brethren named L.B. Wilkes, and that was also printed, the Wilkes-Ditzler debate, one of the few examples of a debate with the Methodists. The Presbyterians debated more than the Methodists did. By the way, L.B. Wilkes, who debated Ditzler, died in Stockton, California. And when I was out there in a gospel meeting with Wayne Jackson, Wayne and I went to the cemetery and visited L.B. Wilkes' grave in Stockton, California. But there was one modern Methodist debater, and his name was R.H. Pigg, P-I-G-U-E, Pigg. And he was from over here around Lauderdale County in West Tennessee. And he was one of the sort of rough and tumble type debaters. Well, he debated one of our younger preachers over there, and the brethren were not too happy with the outcome. They decided they needed to have another debate with Pigg and bring in someone a little stronger. So they sent off to Dallas and got Joe S. Warwick to come and debate with Pigg. Brother Warwick came, and he and Pigg engaged in the debate. And Pigg referred to it in this way. He said, well, he said, I whipped one of their young pups over here. And so he said they had to send off to Texas and get this longhorned ox and bring him in here to try to clean it up. Warwick came along in his speech. He said, I'm ashamed of my brethren. He said, Mr. Pigg said, they sent off to Texas and brought in a longhorned ox to debate with him. He said, my brethren know better than that. They know the Bible says, thou shalt not yoke an ox and an ass together. One time he had a debate with Ben Bogart, and Bogart decided to offer an invitation at the end of the debate. That was not common, but he said there may be those here that would like to join the Baptist church. And he said, we're going to open the doors of the church for any who would like to come in. They sang the verse of the invitation song. Nobody responded. Warwick got up. And Warwick said, well, it is not the usual practice, but since Mr. Bogart has offered an invitation, I'd like to extend an invitation to those who would like to be baptized for the remission of their sins. You've heard our discussion of it, and we're going to have a verse of an invitation song, and if you'd like to obey the gospel, you're invited to respond. 28 Baptists came forward. Warwick said, well, Mr. Bogart opened the doors of his church and 28 of his members got out. So they had a pretty good time among themselves. Now I want to read a statement to you. This is from Bogart's paper, the Missionary Baptist Searchlight, when he heard of the death of Joe Warwick. There is within me a feeling of distinct loss today, for I've just received a telegram that my most valiant antagonist, with whom I had 23 debates, is dead. He and I had some hard contests, and we did not give an inch in our sharp contentions with each other. But our personal friendship grew with the years, and we became as brothers in the flesh. We actually slept together in one of our hard-fought debates, and I shall never forget some fine help he was to me once when I stood in need of help. He did just what he could do. He could have easily refused, but he graciously granted my request. No matter what it was a friendly turn he gave, what has never been forgotten. I wanted to read that from Bogart about Warlick to dispel the notion that many had about debating. They had the idea that it was crude, that it was ugly, that the debaters were mean and sarcastic. And there may have been a few instances of that. Pig, for example, was noted for a bad temper, but by and large, the men who debated were honorable. And the debates were helpful. And there were discussions of what the Bible had to say. You might be interested to know that Joe S. Warlick debated here in Henderson. One of the famous debates of the day was the Stark-Warlick debate. J. Carroll Stark was a Christian church preacher, and he and Warlick debated here in Henderson on instrumental music. And you might not realize how significant that is, but the church building was located about a block from where we are engaged, had an instrument. And I can tell you the story of how it got there and how it got out, all of that, but let me just say that it was a very hot issue here. The school at one time was under the control of those that utilized the instrument. And Brother Foy Wallace, in his book on the instrumental music question, says Joe S. Warlick saved the church in West Tennessee. You were talking about the debate that Stark and Warlick had here. Well, Warlick was quite a debater, and as Bogart said, he was very good with repartee, and if you tried to get anything on him, you probably would have come out on the short end. Warlick had a reputation of getting up and walking around when his opponent was speaking, not taking a note. He'd speak to people out in the crowd. When his opponent would finish his speech, Warlick get up and answer everything he said, not miss a point. He was just an outstanding debater. Well, I want to come to more modern times and wind up our discussion. Here's a great picture. This was taken during the Freed-Hardeman lectureship. That's on the steps of the old church building just down the street. The man on the left is Gus Nichols. In the middle, E.R. Harper. And on the right, Guy and Woods. Now, I don't discuss Brother Harper. He had a few debates, but he was not known like Brother Nichols and Brother Woods. But they were two of the really great debaters. And I want to say this about Gus Nichols. Those of us who were in school at that time, and there are several here, we all looked up to Brother Nichols. We admired him. He was noted for his knowledge of the scriptures and the fact that he was able to reach out and get a scripture for any situation. Well, he had a debate up here around Medina, Tennessee, just north of Jackson, with a primitive Baptist. And there was a light, I think it may have been in a tent, because there was a light that hung down above the head of the speakers and bugs flying around that light. And Brother Nichols was up speaking and a bug flew in his mouth. Always a scriptorian, Brother Nichols said, he was a stranger and I took him in. And the moment he said, but he was lukewarm and I spat him out of my mouth. Guy in Woods, many of you remember from the open forum days. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, I got in a discussion at school with a boy about baptism. He was a good friend of mine and member of a denomination. We talked about the scriptures. And I came home and I asked my father, do you have a book I could read that would help me know how to answer my friend? This is the book that my father gave me. It is an original copy of the Woods Nunnery Debate. Guy in Woods and A.U. Nunnery. Nunnery was a Baptist preacher and debater. I would read one of Nunnery's speeches. Remember now, when I read this book, I was about 15 years old. I would read a speech by Nunnery and I would think, how will Brother Woods ever answer that? I just didn't see how Brother Woods could respond to what this man said. Then I'd get over to the next chapter and I'd read Brother Woods' answer, and he would just devastate everything that Nunnery had presented. And it was such a faith-building exercise for me to see how Brother Woods could handle that and answer everything that was said. And reading Nunnery's speeches today don't seem so formidable to me, but when I was 15 years old, they did. But Guy in Woods was able to answer and respond to everything. Guy Woods told me this story. That debate was held over here at Parsons, Tennessee. And Brother Woods said he was driving to the debate one day and saw a man walking. It was obvious he was going to the debate. Brother Woods said he stopped and offered the man a ride. The man got in his car. Brother Woods took him with him on up to where the debate was. The next day, Brother Woods was coming back for the debate, coming down the road, saw the same man, stopped and invited him to get in. The man refused. Obviously, he was distracted by what Brother Woods had presented or preached, but he was a very able debater. Let's go to the next one. G.K. Wallace was one of my teachers here at school. Brother G.K.'s son-in-law is in the audience here today. And, I admire Brother Wallace. There he is in his younger days. Here he is, as many of us remember him and as we knew him. I want to tell you two strengths that G.K. had in a debate. One was he could take the most complex, difficult question and make it seem simple. He was remarkable in that respect. The other is G.K. Wallace was the most effective man with charts, the old-timey cloth charts that I ever saw. He would hang a chart up with a major argument on it, and he could beat a man to death with it. He was such an effective speaker and debater in debate. I heard him in two debates. I heard him debate D.L. Welch, Pentecostal, long before I ever knew I would debate Welch. But I also heard him in a debate down here at Florence, Alabama, on the anti-orphan home issue with Charles Hope. And Charles was certainly an able debater, but I've never seen a man take a worse whipping. I've heard about people say, he turned green. I thought that was just a figure of speech till I attended that debate. But I thought Charles turned green. And Brother Wallace was so effective in that discussion that it largely killed the influence of Charles Hope in that area from that day forward. I have Brother Wallace's pointer, one of them, that his wife gave to me when Brother Wallace passed away. My wife was his secretary when we were students here at Freed-Hardeman, and we loved and appreciated Brother Wallace very, very much. Now I want to go to the last man because my time's about gone, and I wouldn't be true to you if I didn't at least mention W. Curtis Porter. There's Brother Porter's picture, and by the way, that's the only picture I've ever seen of him. He may have been camera shy, I don't know, but there are very few pictures available of W. Curtis Porter. And I'm going to tell you a little, try to make it short, story that indicates why that may be the case. When I was here in school, one of my Bible teachers was named John Brin. Earl West had been a teacher here in school. W. Curtis Porter debated L.H. Brown, same man that I met in my first debate, at a place called Juneau up here near Jackson. And Earl West had never seen Porter, never heard him. And John Brin said, well, go with me over to the Juneau church and hear the debate. So they went over there, and Brother Brin said to Earl West, see if you can pick out Curtis Porter. Well, there's a fellow over there with a blue suit on. Is that him? No. Is that him over there? No. What I'm trying to tell you is Curtis Porter did not look like a preacher. He looked like somebody that might have come in from plowing, come in from the field, put on a suit. He was not the kind of fellow you'd think of the way he looked as a preacher. He had kind of a ruddy complexion, and he was just a very ordinary looking fellow, but he could be very deceptive. He had a sharp mind. I would say he was nearly the equal of Joe S. Worley when it came to repartee. And I want to mention a thing or two about Porter. One, he was in a debate with Vernon Barr. Vernon Barr was a well-known Baptist debater from out in Dallas. And Barr had a crutch under one arm. And I heard him in a debate down in Tuscumbia with Bill Rogers. He'd swing his foot out, lean on that crutch, and walk around, hobble around up there on the stage. He was a very effective debater. But he debated Brother Porter, and one of the things that you'd always get into with the Baptists was the name. They were sensitive about the fact that there's no mention in the Bible of the Baptist church or Baptist churches or individuals being called Baptists. And very often they would turn on the name Christian and downplay it. And Vernon Barr said in that debate to Curtis Porter, why, Porter, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. He said that was 10 years after Pentecost. Brother Porter tickled me because you could tell when he had something. Kind of like a dog with a bone. I've seen him do this. He just hardly wait to get that answer. You just see it popping out all over. Barr said, why, they weren't called Christians 10 years after Pentecost. Brother Porter said, Mr. Barr, how long after Pentecost were they called Baptists? So Porter had that knack about him. He was very effective in the negative, answering the other fellow. And he debated with Ben Bogard. As a matter of fact, the last debate Ben Bogard ever had was with Curtis Porter. And usually they debated a subject like baptism, apostasy. But Porter and Bogard debated what is called the general church proposition. Proposition said this, Bogard affirmed, the church of which I am a member, known as the Missionary Baptist Church, is scriptural in origin, doctrine, practice, and name. Well, everybody was curious about that name part when he said it was scriptural in name. But Bogard, who was not timid about anything, got up and said, I'm going to start with the name. The Missionary Baptist Church is scriptural in name. He said, a missionary is one who is sent. A Baptist is one who is authorized to baptize, like John the Baptist. A church is a congregation. So he went to the New Testament and he found where the church was sent on a mission. It was authorized to baptize. And so he said that made it the Missionary Baptist Church. Now, Bogard said, you ought to call a thing what it is. How would you answer that? You ought to call a thing what it is. I have shown that it is the Missionary Baptist Church. You ought to call it what it is. And the porter came back, you could just almost visualize it. He said, well, Mr. Bogard approved the name Missionary Baptist Church. Missionary, one sent, Baptist, one who baptizes, church, congregation. He said, let's see. Peter preached in the last days, according to Acts 2. He was a saint. And he was a preacher. So by Mr. Bogard's reasoning, it'd be scriptural to say he was a Latter-day Saint preacher. But then he said, Mr. Bogard said, we ought to call a thing what it is. Now here's the part I love. This is typical of Porter. Porter says, Mr. Bogard, did the apostles call it what it was? You said it is the Missionary Baptist Church, and we ought to call a thing what it is. Did the apostles do what they ought to do? Did they call it the Missionary Baptist Church? I just thought, Porter's mind was working all the time. Then he reached his conclusion. He said, Mr. Bogard said you ought to call a thing what it is. They did not call it the Missionary Baptist Church. So that was not what it was. Responded to everything that Bogard said. Bogard came back and he said, well, Porter, I don't understand you. He said, if I drew a picture of a cat, would I have to write C-A-T under it for you to understand what it was? Porter said, if the picture you drew of the cat was no better than the picture you drew of the Missionary Baptist Church from the Bible, you'd have to write C-A-T under it. My concluding remark. I mentioned a little while ago that all of us here in school at the time had tremendous admiration for Brother Gus Nichols. I heard a student ask Brother Nichols this question. We knew that Brother Nichols had such a wonderful command of the Bible. And a student asked him, and I was standing there listening, Brother Nichols, what would you recommend if we want to really know the Bible and how to use it? I well remember his answer. Brother Nichols said, read the debates of our brethren. That was the estimation he had of that word. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Many of the debates